Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing a really quick video with press plates and printed papers. I'm using the new press plate sentiments from PAScribe. These have Italic sentiments, and the press plates can be used in both the Glimmer system as well as the Betterpress system. We have the Happy Birthday plate, the Thank You plate, as well as the Thinking of You plate, and I will be using them in both the Glimmer system as well as the Betterpress system. For my printed papers, I'm going to be using the new Rosie Studio Jubilee paper pack. I have everything pre-cut and ready to go. I have another video where I am using this paper pack as well as coordinating embellishments and creating more cards with that. So I'll link to that one at the end. I always say how much I love press plates because they've got so much versatility to them. So you can use them in the Betterpress system, you can use them in the Glimmer system. I'm going to start with using them in the Glimmer system. I have a paper from that Jubilee paper pack that to me looks like birthday pennant banners. So I thought it worked well with the birthday press plate. I'm using some black foil. There's some black lines that those pennants are on. So I thought that coordinated nicely with this. I'm not going to do much else with this card simply because we've got some pattern paper in the background and I don't think it really needs a whole lot after that. I did tape my press plate in place as well as cut the excess foil to prevent some overfoiling. I use my regular stacking on my Glimmer system. I have the press plate with the image side up, my foil with the pretty side down, and then my printed paper on top of there. And then I press the timer button, and once that went off, I put it through my Platinum 6 machine for the pressure. So we can see that we have a nice bold happy birthday on that background. You could use other foils as well. I definitely would choose one that is nice and bold for a patterned background because anything that's soft or light colored would be hard to see on top of the pattern from that background. To give it a little bit of extra visual dimension, I put it on my sticky mat and I'm just using some Evergreen Bow Distress ink just to ink blend around the edges. It just frames it in a little bit. It gives it more visual dimension and I really like the look of ink blending on printed papers. I think it just gives them a little bit more interest. That is a step though. If that's not your cup of tea, you could leave it alone and not have that on there, but I do think it adds a lot to that front. I'm using some Orchid Cardstock for my mat, and that was trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. My printed paper here was trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and that was trimmed down before I did my foiling, only because I had trimmed it down in the prep, but you could easily foil first and then trim it down afterwards. To add just a little bit of extra texture to this card as well as some sparkle, I'm using some gems. These ones are gold mixed gems. There's some gold foiling on those pennant banners on the background. So these gold mixed gems are going to coordinate nicely with that as well as give that extra little bit of dimension and that little bit of sparkle. Just give it a little bit more interest. You could also, if you wanted, add a die cut. I think this would be fun with, say, a die cut balloon on it as well. But I didn't want to overwhelm it. I wanted to keep these cards fairly simple because of those printed papers, but they do have some elegance to them because of the Italic script for those sentiments. For my next card, I'm going to be using the Betterpress system with the Thank You press plate. I'm going to do some heat embossing of the sentiment on vellum. So I'm going to tape the scrap of vellum in place on my clear plate. You could use a larger piece if you wanted. I just happen to have a scrap that was going to be the right size for it. And then I'm placing the plate on the bottom of my Betterpress system. I put the clear plate over top just to make sure that it was completely covering that sentiment and I had the part of the sentiment that I wanted covered with vellum. Then I use some embossing powder tool on that vellum and then ink that plate up with some Versamark ink. If by chance your plate moves while you're inking it up, because the Versamark ink can be a little bit sticky, you want to make sure to move that back into place before putting the clear plate on the base and then running it through your die cutting machine. So that's going to press that thank you sentiment with that Versamark ink onto that vellum. And I'm going to heat emboss this with some gold embossing powder. So I have some superfine gold embossing powder that I am pouring onto that background. I have the background nice and clean. If by chance you have embossing powder where you don't want it to go, use a soft brush and remove any of that powder before melting it because you will not be able to remove it once it's melted. Now, the one thing with vellum that people have a hard time with and struggle with is gluing vellum down. Because it's transparent, it's not very forgiving when it comes to adhesive. My trick is to use double-sided tape. I use double-sided tape sheets with it. I have some Sukwang or score tape that is on a 5-inch wide roll. I'm going to trim this close to the finish size that I want, and then I'm going to put it on that tape. This is a transparent tape that's going to cover the whole back, so we're not going to see any adhesive because it's covering that entire back. Sometimes with vellum adhesives, you still see through the vellum, so I don't like using them. This is the one way that I've found that you can glue things down with that vellum and not see through it because it's covering that entire base. For this card, I have some matte gold cardstock from the Gold Treasured Cardstock pack that I'm using as my matte. You can see that I've cut 2 tulips out of here. One was for a card for a previous video, and then one is for a card for this video. I am going to add that tulip die cut to the front of this card. I thought it was going to be a nice complement to that thank you sentiment. So with that score tape on the back of my vellum, I trimmed that down to the size that I want. I can take that backing off and I can put it on top of my printed paper. Now I chose to do this on vellum simply because it's going to mute the colors of that printed paper just a little bit, but you still see that print through there. If you don't necessarily want to mute the colors on your background, you can do your heat embossing right to your print, and I'll do that with the next card. But it's a great way if you're working on a really busy print. This one actually isn't very busy, but if you are working on a very busy print, it's a way to just tone that down and mute it just a little bit. I'm using some Barely Art glue to glue down all of my pieces of my cards as well as little die cuts here. And I'm just going to do some very simple paper piecing. So I used the matte gold cardstock that I used for my matte for the background of this card to cut out the outline for this tulip. And then I also used some mint cardstock for the stem as well as the leaf, and then Tutu cardstock for the petals of the flower. So you can see that I'm putting glue on each one of them and inserting them in the opening. It's like putting a puzzle piece together. They fit in there perfectly, but it gives you some different colors for your tulip. It gives you a little bit more interest to it, as well as giving you that dimension from the die cut. So by using that liquid glue, I can use as much or as little as I want, and I can move and shimmy it in place, and it starts to set fairly quickly. I want to say like 10-15 seconds. So not like you have to wait a long time for that to set on you. Now with that done, and I did overlap my thank you just a tiny little bit, but you still can read that thank you really, really well. Our card is completely finished. Now you could add some gems here if you wanted to. I didn't add them to that one because I already thought it had enough dimension and enough interest with that gold metallic as well as the gold matte cardstock and then that die cut. For my last card, I'm going to be using that Thinking of You plate, and I want to use actually 2 press plates to this. So I'm going to use the Thinking of You for my sentiment, and then I'm going to use the October Cosmos plate to add a floral pressed image to the background. Now here I'm trying to decide whether I want to do the floral image first or the sentiment first. I'm doing this sentiment first because I'm going to heat emboss that with some white embossing powder on my background. It would be great to do gold here as well, but I'm going to use some gold ink for my flower, but I'm not going to heat emboss the flower. So we're going to get 2 different textures with that. We're going to get some gold metallic ink with that flower, and then that heat embossed white with that embossed dimension for our sentiment. So I taped that piece onto the clear plate of my Betterpress system. Then I inked my plate with that Versamark ink using a little bit of embossing powder tool on that printed paper and press that onto that background. And now I can pour on that white embossing powder and heat emboss that sentiment. Now for all the cards, I mentioned the measurements on the first card, but I didn't measure them on these 2 here. For all of them, the matte is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. The printed paper on the front with the pressed image or foiled image is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. And I pre-cut these down when I was doing my prep for my video, but you can easily have them a little bit larger and then cut them down afterwards. If you don't exactly know where you want your pressed image to be, it's better to cut it down afterwards so you can customize exactly where that placement is. Now I want this flower in a specific spot, so I lay that down on my printed paper and then put my clear plate onto my base the opposite way that I normally do. I leave that plate where it's supposed to be, put my base onto that clear plate, and it just sticks with those magnets in the 4 corners, and then I press it down so that I know that I have the perfect placement for that plate. I use the Lisa Horton gold ink pad This is a fabulous pad. All the metallic inks are fabulous. They've got some beautiful metallic shine to it, and they're easy to use with both the Betterpress system as well as just using with ink blending. Now with the Betterpress system, you want to be careful with them because they are foam pads, so you can press down and get a lot of ink where you really don't need it. So I err on the side of caution. I'm lighter handed when I start, and once I get a feel for how much ink there is, then I press a little bit heavier. For this particular one, I'm using some Cascade cardstock for my mat around my printed paper here. I only did ink blending on the first one, but you could certainly do it on the second and the third card as well if you wanted to add that detail to it. For this card, I'm using the Crystal Mix Gems to add some sparkle to the background. And again, it just adds a little bit of texture and a little bit of sparkle. These gems have 4 different sizes to them. So typically I'll do a cluster of 3, sometimes a cluster of 2, and I'll make sure that they're different sizes. It just looks a little bit more visually interesting. And then the odd time I'll add just 1. So I add 1 in the top left, and then I change my mind on the positioning. I'm putting them down with a die pick. It makes it really easy to just put that die pick into the adhesive on the back and then position it where I want, and then I can use my finger to press it in place. The last step for this card is using a little bit of stickles in the center of the flower. It's an opalescent glitter stickles, so it just gives that texture from the glitter. It doesn't add any color. You can still see the color from the ink on that image. And then I wanted the stems for the image to be just a little bit longer. They kind of cut off at an area that I thought they just looked a little bit too short. So I just used a gold gel pen to extend them a little bit, going pretty carefully to make sure that I was following the same lines as the pressed image. But I think they look a little bit better when they're longer. They just look like the card is complete a little bit more. This is the finished result. I just love the look of the very simple cards. They're very, very simple and very easy to do. They come together really, really quickly. It probably took more time to prep things and to do die cutting than it did for the actual cards themselves. But they have some fun textures to them, interest to them because of those printed papers in the background, and then because of the different techniques we used with those press plates on the front. And these are only a couple ideas you can use with them. You can use many different ways of using those press plates to get a lot more interest as well. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find all the supplies that I used listed and linked down in the description box below. I hope you have a fantastic day.